So why was Bermuda important in the launching of the early rockets? We've got to remember that the planet turns from west to east, and when you launch a rocket, it gains momentum from its own speed and uses less fuel. So the rocket launches ideally were on the Atlantic coast, because then if something goes wrong, the rocket crashes in the water and rather than in a populated area potentially. So Bermuda from the very beginning was really important for that reason, and also because the most momentum you get from the Earth's rotation is around the equator, which would be fairly close to Florida. And when the decision was made to launch them from Florida, from Cape Canaveral, now Kennedy Space Center, Bermuda became really important because it was the first station which could actually follow the track of the rockets. And unfortunately, in the 1960s, when all of this started with Project Mercury, the computers generally were not powerful enough to transmit in real time the data from Bermuda to Florida. So Bermuda was most important for about a 15-minute period of each launch. And Bermuda had the authority to control that rocket and make the go, no-go decision, which was crucial, obviously, during the later period, the Apollo period. And Bermuda became the latest computers from the States, and as I said, controlled the rockets for about a 15-minute period while it was right underneath them. So a little bit about rockets generally. The first ballistic missiles were developed in Germany during World War II. And after when the war was over, both the Russians, the Brits, and the Americans scrambled to get hold of both rockets as well as the people, the engineers. And America was fortunate that they got the design team from Werner von Braun and General Walter Dornberger. And this is probably the one reason why America initially had the advantage of not just the rocket design, but anyway. So in 1947, which is only 2 years after the war, it was decided to try and launch one of the German V2s from a aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, south of Bermuda. So Bermuda was already involved a little bit in that very early period. Now, a little bit about Cooper's Island. So Cooper's Island is the easternmost point, basically, of Bermuda. It was part of the Kinley Air Force Base, so it was American-controlled, and the American Air Force or the American government leased the Cooper's Island portion, which was about 70-odd acres of land, to NASA to build there both the operations buildings and then and the various radar facilities. And when we look at the next 10-year period, we first have the Mercury, about 3 years, 1961 to 1963, the Mercury period, and then the Gemini, which was a program towards the Apollo moon launches, and I'll get to that in just a moment here. But there's some photographs here which may be of interest to you. The radar facilities on Cooper's Island. And for example, the middle picture is an interesting one. That radar malfunctioned during the very last Mercury flight, and which was then delayed by 1 day. But anyway, it did get off the ground. So at one point, Bermuda had about 135 employees working at the facility. And on the left, you see some rather interesting indoor shots of all the computer systems and so on. So there were 135 people employed there. About 50 of them were Bermudians, mainly engineers and whatever, in the power plants and all around. And in 1962, when John Glenn became the first American to actually orbit the Earth, his capsule was afterwards displayed in Bermuda, and I happened to be there. It was in February 1962 in front of City Hall. Some of you may recognize the windows there. And I took some pictures. Here's the governor arriving and his wife and adjutant to look. And the lower picture shows a bunch of school children. There were literally thousands, I think. All the school kids from Bermuda were there, all sort of dressed very nicely, and with the boys all with ties. And in the middle of it is Heidi, my wife, holding it up. And let's see. So, as I said, Project Mercury were the first 3 years, and Project Apollo was the final effort to get to the moon. But in between, there was this Project Gemini, where a lot of the testing of the equipment and the different systems was being tested. And that took several years. So let's then at the end of Bermuda's importance were the space shuttles, starting in 1981 until the early 90s, mid-90s. And in between, we'll talk about that later, there were numerous other launches, but we'll get to that in a moment. So let's look at the philatelic aspect, and that's why we are here, actually. So my earliest Bermuda cover is actually of a chimpanzee. NASA had a total of 32 chimps which flew in space, but none of them survived, I don't think. This first one obviously drowned off Bermuda when it was landed. And so this was in 1961 already. In 1962, the first envelopes were created by different collectors, I guess. I don't know whether that first one on the left, the one in the middle, had anything to do with the NASA tracker station, or whether an individual collector made it up. But anyway, that's my earliest one from a flight. And then we got into, by 1963, Mercury, that this was the ninth flight, MA9. Gordon Cooper, who completed like 22 orbits, but then it was already much more organized. Collectors could submit envelopes to NASA, and they were then stamped with the return address already, PO Box 58, St. George's. And so these are the very early examples. On the right page, another one from the Mercury 9 flight. That's Mercury was the name of the project, and of course Atlas was the rocket they used. And then we find the earliest ones where NASA actually signed covers. Walter Fleur, and he was the station director, and so you could actually submit envelopes, have them pre-printed and with postage. And they would then, after the flight, mail them out. So this is the earliest one that I have from that very period. But then very quickly, by the third Gemini flight, NASA had produced labels, which they put on the different envelopes which people submitted, and again, signed by the station director. So this one, we are now talking about 1965, so the mid-60s. And then the Gemini period was interesting because that's when they had to get all the systems right for the moon landing. And so that was several years, and you can see here from 1965 on, sometimes flight covers were signed by the astronauts, like the one on the lower left. This was Frank Borman and Jim Lovell. But all the covers were signed by the station director himself. And then we start getting the Apollo flights, but the Gemini flights were still conducted at the same time to kind of improve things. So the upper cover on the left is from, I think that was the first Apollo flight, 203. Here they use Saturn rockets, then more powerful rockets. 1966. Anyway, so all of this was in preparation for the Apollo flights. And they started in 1967, up on the left. I think it's my first one, 501. Flight. So these are all the various Apollo flights. And then we get to the actual flight to the moon. Apollo 10, 12, now we're into 69 already. And the 13th flight in 1970. So this was the third moon landing mission already. They started obviously a little bit earlier in late 69. Is another one signed by one of the astronauts, Slayton. Apollo 14, 15, 16, 17. And this was the final, I believe that was the final lunar landing mission in 1972. So all of this had to do with the flight to the moon, landing a man on the moon. And now comes an interesting period in the 1970s, when first the Skylab was constructed in space. So there are quite a few envelopes and flights available for that. Skylab stabilizing. So this is all in the early 70s, Skylab flights. And sometimes they even commemorated the splashdown like the one on the lower right. And by 1975, by the mid-70s, we get the cooperation with the Russians, with the Soyuz spacecraft. So this is a joint venture then. The Viking rockets, the Viking actually was a flight to Mars. the first time a rocket was sent to Mars. Another effort was in conjunction with France and Germany. The rockets launched this Symphony communication satellites for Europe. Intelsat, which was a geostationary satellite, was launched in 75. RCA had several launched, Globcoms. And then there were a series of launches for NATO for their communication systems. And this was in 76 already. The lower one on the left is Lagos. That stood for high precision laser ranging. They were expanding with that. Then we had ComSat domestic satellites were being launched for the Navy, the Marisat. Communications for shipping. The one on the left, Palapa, that was an Indonesian satellite, which was launched here by NASA. Further improved Marisat launches for the Navy. Comstar for domestic communication, American domestic communication. Marisat C, that was the third one for the Navy. Another NATO flight, 1977 now. And then a second one for Indonesia in 1977. Intelsat. EOS. Meteorological satellites. A particular one for high energy astronomy. And then Voyager again. And by now, the station manager had kind of fallen down on his job, and he let his secretary sign everything. So all of these covers signed by Karen McBride. As were these. The one on the top left, Sirio, was an Italian satellite, a research satellite. The lowest one, an orbital test satellite. On the right, one for Japanese. A Japanese satellite was launched. So you can see there were many different satellites launched during the 1970s. Of course, at that point, this space shuttle was being developed, and that came a little bit later, as of 1980. One particular one on the left for ultraviolet exploration. Another one for the Navy. Underneath. The one on the lower left was an interesting one. It was meant to help any country in the world that needed information about, their geography and so on. So this was a free effort for the countries who couldn't afford their own satellites. At one point, on the upper right in 1978, Skylab was reactivated. It had been dormant for several years. So there was a launch towards that. Below it, a Japanese broadcast satellite. And on the next page, I've got one that went to Venus. Skylab had been reactivated, but wasn't stable, so they had to go up and stabilize it. That was commemorated. Another one for the navies on the right. Comstar was launched quite a few of these for the domestic communications. There was one on the bottom right for International Sun-Earth Explorer. So I guess they tried to figure something out. And then the second one, more satellites for NATO. Telesat, that was for, again, domestic communication. A particular one for charging at high altitude, spacecraft charging. These were all experiments already towards the space shuttle as well. One on aerosol and gas experiments. By now we're in 79, so towards the end of that period. Below it, another fleet satellite. A British satellite was launched there in 1979 as well. And then finally, Skylab came back to Earth. And that was also commemorated by NASA. So, but it landed in the Indian Ocean and Australia. Vesta. RCA had several launched. The solar maximum issue, whatever mission, whatever that, I don't know what that did. Chaos. The one on the bottom is a particular satellite for fleet operations between aircraft, ships, and submarines. So now we are looking at, again, this is 1980 now. So, and then we get into the first space shuttle launch, and this was 1980. 1981, the second launch by, I can't read this here, this is covered up by yourselves. Columbia was the second launch in 81. And in between, they launched a satellite for Vesta. So the space shuttle missions, they were called STS, Space Transportation Systems, I think it stood for. And here in 1982, the third launch by Space Shuttle Columbia. The fourth launch, there were only 2 astronauts on board on that one. altogether, there were 135 space shuttle launches which were monitored from Bermuda. So the list goes on and on and on. For most of the 80s into the early 90s. The upper one on the left of launch number 9, kind of interesting. Somebody came up with a different envelopes, a layout of Castle Harbor and the NASA tracking station. It's kind of cute. So now we're by 1985. You're probably wondering why some of these have got Bermuda stamps and others have got American stamps. When you send them envelopes, pre-addressed and usually with labels which have been peeled off or something, and stamped, you could either use Bermuda stamps or American, and the Bermuda ones were generally, early on at least, mailed in St. George's, a few in Hamilton, but generally in St. George's, which was closed. But at one point in the 1980s, Bermuda opened the St. David's Island Post Office specifically for America's use. So a lot on this page, for example, are all from St. David's, which is nice. Here are some examples from the US Navy. So now we are at 1990 roughly. And you can see these are the ones from the 30th and 40th launch. And then they must have run out of the labels, because from then on, it's just rubber stamps used by NASA. And generally a lot more mailed by the US Navy rather than Bermuda at that point. So these are the different launches from the 1990s. And here you see on the right-hand page, covers addressed to our own John Hussein. Hi, John.
Hello, Horst.
Okay. He was very good at this. He was like persevering. He would, every trip to Bermuda, he was down there on Cooper's Island, meeting the various ladies who signed this. You probably remember some of them, I'm sure.
I do.
And Don Stevens got involved as well, creating covers. So all of these are the later space shuttle launches. And you can see that the number of each launch isn't necessarily in numeric order, because they would prepare a launch, but then another one would be launched first. For example, on the left, launch 66 followed by 63 and then 67. And 68 was way ahead before that. But I have put them on here in chronological order of the launch. So these are almost, there's one from Bob Dickies. And these are all from John Poussin. From
I was
17.
busy.
Pardon?
I was busy.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So then we get to the late 1990s, and by then there are so many satellites in orbit, and NASA could control the launches and the data via their own satellites, and Bermuda became basically obsolete, the Bermuda station. So the NASA station now was handed back by the American Air Force and became what it is now, a nature reserve. I think, John, you couldn't find it the other day when you went there. There should be some activity again with SpaceX. But these are basically containers. Everything is contained in containers, and I guess fully automated, basically. But they're still helping with the launch information. But generally speaking, Cooper's Island is a nature reserve and very popular for Bermudians. So this is what's happening now in the 1920s. A group of containers and still involved with NASA and SpaceX, I guess. And John not only created these envelopes, many of them, he also compiled a detailed list of the launches. So we thank him for that. And that is about it. That's all I have to say. Except I'm sorry about the complications in the beginning here. That wasn't too good.
Like to see some dollar signs beside those individual flights with a total at the bottom. Can you imagine? I say, I'd like to see some dollar signs beside each of those flights